Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. First of all, let me begin by saying I'm very, very pleased to be here with you. I have traveled to New York City far too many times to try to even begin to count on human rights related issues, but I consider this to be one of the most important issues that I've traveled to New York City for. I'm based in the Washington, D.C. metro area. This issue of Zionism is one that has beguiled me, for lack of a better description, for a long time. My introduction to this issue on a deep level occurred back in the early 80s with the siege on Lebanon, more specifically the massacres that took place in Sabra and Shatila. I ended up writing a poem that I'd like to begin with, a poem simply entitled Israel, O Israel. A nation of people born from injustice, causing great sorrow in all civilized among us. You claim your only concern to be your security, but your true intent is plain enough for everyone to see. There are Jews among you who detest what you do, but their voices are muffled and they seem to be few. You're proud and you're arrogant, malicious and clever. You seem to think world sympathy is going to shield you forever. Oh, but the bed is too short and the covers are too narrow. You can't see the handwriting, for your scope is too narrow. Aggressive you've been since the day you were born, from the anguish and misery of lives you have torn. Israel, O Israel, where will you be when the pages have dried on your history? So that was written right after the siege on Lebanon. The massacres, and what is so tragic is that these words could have been easily written today, because the only thing that has changed is that the insanity has just deepened, and largely because of the kind of support that that Zionist apartheid state receives from my own country, that likes to project itself around the world as the land of liberty and justice for all. Let me also note in my introductory comments that I always strive to make a distinction between Zionism and Judaism. I was an admirer of the late Dr. Alfred Lilienthal, and I truly love one of his quotes that I would like to share with you now. He said, "Zionism is not Judaism, and Judaism is not Zionism. And to be anti-Zionist is in no way to be anti-Semitic. Zionism is a political movement devoted to the founding and advancement of the State of Israel, politically, diplomatically, financially, and otherwise. On the other hand, Judaism is a religious faith, a relationship between man and God, requiring no political loyalty to any country. Too often religion and nationalism have become mixed up." End quote. Very beautiful and on point quote from the late Dr. Alfred Lilienthal to lay the foundation for what I'm going to share with you. And let me also note, it's going to probably come as a surprise, the primary substance that my presentation will be in the form of, because it's actually stemming from an article that I read today. In fact, I didn't even get to read it in its entirety. It's a very long piece. I read about half of it, made my own little commentaries and parentheses at different points in it. And I just thought that this would be an ideal mode of presentation on this topic of Zionism and the state of Israel in Africa. Again, this was written by an insider, by a Zionist insider. It's titled "The Evolution of Israel's Africa Policy." And it's coming from the JewishVirtualLibrary.org. Fascinating read. Long before the state of Israel was established, the father of modern political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, had looked to Africa and recognized parallels between the black and Jewish experiences. In his book, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Altnulen, published in 1902, just 5 years after the Zionist conference in Basel formally initiated the drive for a Jewish state, Herzl wrote that, quote, "Once I have witnessed the redemption of the Jews, my people, I wish also to assist in the redemption of the Africans," end quote. Almost immediately after the redemption of the Jewish people, Herzl's interest in helping the Africans was taken up by the leaders of Israel. Their idealistic and egalitarian attitude toward Africa was typified by the architect of Israel's Africa policy, Golda Meir, who believed that the lessons learned by Israelis could be passed on to Africans who, particularly during the 1950s, were engaged in the same process of nation building. Quote, "Like them," she said, "we had shaken off foreign rule. Foreign rule. Like them, we had to learn for ourselves how to reclaim the land, how to increase the yields of our crops, how to irrigate, how to raise poultry, how to live together, and how to defend ourselves," end quote. Israel could provide a better model for a newly independent African state, Meir believed, because Israelis had been forced, quote, this is a quote, had been forced to find solutions to the kinds of problems that large, wealthy, powerful states had never encountered, end quote. While there is no doubt that Israeli leaders have always had philanthropic attitudes toward Africa, their primary interests in the continent rested on the more tangible grounds of realpolitik. Just as Africa was the scene of a battle of influence among the superpowers, so too has it been a battlefield between Israel and the Arabs. The battlefield was particularly important during, and on this note, this battlefield between the Israel and the Arabs, there's a quote that I'm going to share with you from former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski that you will find no doubt very interesting. This battlefield was particularly important during Israel's first 2 decades because the United States had not yet proven itself a reliable ally for that matter, nor for that matter had the Soviet Union proven itself as the guarantor of its clients in the Arab world. Thus, it was not necessarily hyperbole when Dan Avni, the deputy director of the Africa Department of Israel's Foreign Ministry, described the struggle in Africa as, quote, "a fight of life and death for us," end quote. Thus, even small African nations like Togo became pawns in the effort to obtain an advantage on the continent. Now that the U.S., and this is my perspective, that now that the U.S. is solidly and shamefully ensconced within the Zionist column, philanthropic pretensions, to use the description here, are no longer necessary. Although Mayer, getting back to the article, although Mayer denied that realpolitik was Israel's primary motive, Israeli concern for nations like Togo rested largely on the fact that their votes at the United Nations General Assembly counted equally with those of the United States or Russia. Since Israel already faced a large hostile voting bloc from the Arab and Muslim states, it was important for Israel to try to win as many African votes as possible if it was to have any hope of avoiding constant censure in the General Assembly. And I should note here parenthetically that the state of Israel, to my knowledge, has been the most censured country in the UN, despite the UN's toothless history on this unfortunate crisis in the Middle East. From the perspective of the African states, however, it made less sense to side with Israel than with the Arab states, because the latter bloc votes were needed in international forums like the United Nations to exert pressure on the major powers to protect their own interests. Israel has only one vote in the UN and is not represented in the Organization for African Unity, whereas the Arabs have 18 members in the UN and 6 in the OAU. Now I read somewhere recently, about maybe a month ago, that the state of Israel was petitioning the OAU for status. I don't know where that is, but I would not be surprised if they end up getting it. After 1967, the Arab states also enjoyed a propaganda advantage in Africa because of Israel's occupation of Arab territories, which was seen by Africans as a possible precedent for the expansion of South Africa or Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. The Africans were also less frightened by Arab designs after the death of Egyptian President Gamal Nasser, because his successor, Anwar Sadat, was far less interested in Pan-Arabism, the movement to unite the Arab world, which was perceived as a threat to African independence. The issue of South Africa and apartheid actually provided a good example of Israel's priorities in Africa. In denouncing apartheid for the first time in the early 1960s, despite the presence of a very large South African Jewish community, Israel risked its relations with a country that had been friendly. There is no question that Israel found the apartheid system abhorrent. Can you believe those words? But its condemnation was also meant to attract support from the more numerous black African states. It was not until the 1970s, after the black African states severed their ties with Israel, that Israeli-South African relations became close, but reports exaggerated the degree of closeness. Now let me say this parenthetically. The uncomfortable truths behind this patently false assertion represents an Achilles heel for Zionist Israel in the annals of modern-day African history. Apartheid South Africa and Zionist Israel were like Siamese twins on the international bloc. Israel not only aided apartheid South Africa in practically every facet of its brutal oppression of black South Africa, but it also made it possible for South Africa to become the first nuclear power on the continent. And far from abhorring the evils of South African apartheid, Israel has been successful in constructing an oppressive system that is far, far worse. Getting back to the article. No Israeli policy sufficed to offset the image that her enemies presented to the Africans, that Israel was a nation of white Europeans who had expelled more than 1 million people from their homeland in furtherance of imperialist efforts to retain a foothold in the Middle East. As an African state which shared the Muslim religion with much of the continent, Egypt held a major advantage in its competition with Israel prior to the 1979 peace treaty. Quote, "The people of Africa will continue to look up to us, who guard the northern gate of the continent, and who are its connecting link with the world outside," Nasser wrote. "We cannot under any condition," he added, "relinquish our responsibility in helping in every way possible in diffusing the light of civilization into the farthest parts of that virgin jungle," end quote. Now, to be honest, this is me again, parenthetically speaking. To be honest, this quote attributed to Nasser has the ring of an Arab colonial mindset vis-a-vis Africa south of the Sahara. But that's another argument for another time. Let it suffice to say for this presentation that the late Gamal Abdel Nasser was more Arab nationalist than he was Muslim. Egypt tried to use its geographical advantage to extract political condemnation of Israel from the African states at every opportunity. But with the exception of the Asian African Conference at Bandung in April of 1955, had little success. The reason for this, Michael Brecher has suggested, is that, quote, "there was no emotional disposition to favor the Arab cause. Some Africans had no contact with either Jew or Arab, while those who knew the Arabs recalled the slave trade above all," end quote. Indeed, he goes on to note, quote, "for many Africans, Israelis were Europeans, but this was not automatically a symbol of derision, as it was for many Asians," end quote. Now, I noted parenthetically here, Arabs, Islam, and the slave trade is a much misunderstood and manipulated phenomenon within the black African mind. All nations, tribes, and cultures practiced slavery at different points in history. In fact, the word slave itself has a white origin, according to the late J.A. Rogers. It comes from the word Slav, a Germanic people who were reduced to slavery by the Romans. History suggests that of all slave-making systems, the European slave trade was the most oppressive and dehumanizing of them all. Getting back to the article. The Bandung Conference had a tremendous impact on Israel, however, because the fact that Israel had not even been invited indicated that after 7 years, the nation was still isolated in its own region. To combat this isolation, Israel sought to establish diplomatic relations with African states and to offer them aid. Unlike the aid from the superpowers, Israel's came without strings attached. Yeah, right. Not so much because it did not hope to obtain support in exchange, but because it was in no position to demand it. In addition, Israel feared that if it failed to give aid, then Egypt would step in and fill the vacuum. Quote, "Our aid to the new countries," Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion told the Knesset in 1960, "is not a matter of philanthropy. We are no less in need of the fraternity of friendship of the new nations than they are of our assistance," end quote. Now, parenthetically, to say Israel's aid came without strings attached is extremely duplicitous. And this duplicity was recognized during that time. In the September 1964 edition of the Egyptian Gazette, El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, aka Malcolm X, was quoted as follows, quote, "The number one weapon of 20th century imperialism is Zionist dollarism, and one of the main bases for this weapon is Zionist Israel. The ever-scheming European imperialists is wisely placed Israel where she could geographically divide the Arab world, infiltrate and sow the seeds of dissension among African leaders, and also divide Africans against the Asians. In short, the Zionist argument to justify Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine has no intelligent or legal basis in history, not even in their own religion. Where is their Messiah? End quote. It is also worth noting the observation made by former U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski in a formerly classified memorandum or white paper issued by the National Security Council on March 17, 1978. A revealing excerpt reads as follows, quote, "We must envisage," and this is a very, very, very important quote that I'm about to share with you from the former National Security Advisor from the Carter administration. He said, "We must envisage the possibility, however remote, that Black Americans interested in African affairs may refocus their attention on the Arab-Israeli conflict, taking into account the African descent of American blacks. It is reasonable to anticipate their sympathies would lie with the Arabs, who are closer to them in spirit and in some cases related to them by blood. Black involvement in lobbying to support the Arabs may lead to serious dissension between American blacks and Jews." End quote. That is a very revealing quote. That was part of this, at the time it was drafted, top secret, classified white paper.
What's the last line in that again?
Black involvement in lobbying to support the Arabs may lead to serious dissension between American blacks and Jews. And, you know, and this is what happened. And in fact, it's quite interesting to note that not long after these words were written in that secret memorandum, the anti-apartheid movement in the United States, along with a rise in consciousness and resistance against apartheid in occupied Palestine, significantly increased. And so, you know, they, as these experts are wont to do, they had their finger on the pulse. They knew exactly where things were heading, and the purpose of this paper was to try to head it off. Getting back to the article. The labor and socialist movements in Israel made the first contacts with the Africans, and in 1958, Israel's Labor Federation inaugurated Israel's formal instructional program with an international seminar in cooperation. The first Israeli embassy in Africa, only its 8th overall, was opened in Accra, Ghana in November 1956. 2 years later, Golda Meir made a 5-week trip to Africa and had the first high-level discussions with African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, William Tubman, and Felix Houphouët Boigny. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. That helped to show Israeli interest in the African liberation movements, as well as to stimulate African interest in Israel. Trade with Africa has always been one-sided, since Israel's major imports, such as oil and grain, are for the most part not available from that continent. Consequently, the aid that Israel provided its African friends was of greater value than the economic advantages it reaped. As noted above, however, Israel was more interested in political than economic advantages. One of Israel's main contributions to Africa was military aid, and it remains that way to this day. And one could say for better or worse, but we know that it's been for the worse. which was provided in the form of conventional and paramilitary training and to a lesser extent by the sale of arms. By 1966, 10 African states had received some direct military assistance from Israel, and in each case, the aid was provided to individuals who were either influential or potentially influential. For example, Israel trained Mobutu Sese Seko, the general of the Congolese army, who 2 years later became the nation's president with Israel's help. And an oppressive president he was. This is me speaking now, with Zionist Israel's aid. The Arab League continued to pressure the Africans to expel Israeli advisors and technicians and to recognize the threat that Israel represented. Quote, "The danger lurks under the glittering surface of trade and aid offered by Israel to some emerging states during the last few years," a League statement said in 1963. Tel Aviv's offers have been in reality a facade for neocolonialism, trying to sneak into Africa through a back window after the old, well-known colonialism had been driven out through the front door, end quote. African leaders viewed Israel's efforts differently. For example, during the 1962 visit to Israel, President Deco of the Central African Republic remarked, quote, and again this was on his visit to the state of Israel, quote, "You have not tried to create us in your image. Instead, Israel has contented itself with showing the new African nations its achievements, in helping them overcome their weaknesses, in assisting them in learning. In so doing, you have conquered Black Africa," end quote. Just conquered the mind of this particular leader. This effort to conquer Africa by providing trade and aid is only one facet of Israel's strategy for obtaining an advantage in its conflict with the Arabs. A second aspect of Israel's policy involves a strategically located African country, Ethiopia, which the Israelis were already cultivating for all the reasons discussed above. In the 1950s, Israel hoped to form an alliance with the United States, but Secretary of State John Foster Dulles advised President Dwight Eisenhower against any formal agreement. Consequently, Israel began to look for other allies that might help encircle her enemies with a ring of friends. In late 1957 and 1958, Ben-Gurion sent agents to 3 non-Arab countries, Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia, to explore possibilities for an alliance. As non-Arab states were with long historical ties to the Jewish people and strategically important geographic locations, these nations were potentially valuable allies. In the case of Ethiopia, the nation is located in the Horn of Africa and has a coastline along the Red Sea. The approach to Ethiopia was made after the Suez War and the Gulf of Aqaba had been recognized as an international waterway. Hence, Israel saw Ethiopia's port as a gateway not only to Ethiopia, but to the rest of Africa. In addition, as a predominantly Christian nation, Ethiopia is, along with Israel, the only non-Muslim riparian state, and therefore a deterrent to Arab efforts to make the Red Sea either an Arab or an Islamic lake. When Egypt blockaded the Straits of Tiran in 1956, it became particularly clear to Israel's leaders that it was necessary to have a friend on the Red Sea coast in order to avert any future blockades. That waterway would become progressively more important as the amount of Persian Gulf oil moving to Israel from its new friend in Iran, this was during the time of the Shah of Iran, increased. It became even more significant in the 1970s after the Suez Canal reopened and traffic resumed between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. In addition to Ethiopia's strategic location, Israel believed that Ethiopia's stability was a key to the stability of the Horn of Africa, and that it was in Israel's interest to prevent Ethiopia's subversion by Egypt or Saudi Arabia. The most overt threat to Ethiopia came from Somalia, which Israel had also approached in the hope of establishing diplomatic ties, and by which it had been consistently rebuffed. That predominantly Muslim country, moreover, joined the Arab League, thereby convincing Israel of the need to solidify its relationship with Ethiopia. From Ethiopia's perspective, the alliance with Israel was also advantageous, since the late 1950s was the period of Nasser's greatest influence and hence most threatening to Ethiopia. There were also long historical ties between Ethiopia and the Jewish people, and personal ties between Emperor Haile Selassie and not only the Jewish people but also Palestine. Haile Selassie considered himself the Lion of Judah, a direct descendant of the Jewish people. Moreover, after the Italian conquest of Ethiopia in 1936, Haile Selassie and his family, as well as many other Ethiopians, spent part of their time in exile in Jerusalem. 6 years later, when he returned to Ethiopia, the emperor established the first modern links with the Jews of Palestine. The first Israeli delegation arrived in Ethiopia in 1955 for the celebration of the Emperor's Silver Jubilee. I'm going to stop there with this read, but I want to encourage everyone here to access that article.
What is the name of the guy?
Well, there is no.
All right, it's just the Jewish library.
Yeah. It's the Jewish Virtual Library.org.
It's a good source.
Yeah, the Evolution of Israel's Africa Policy is the name of the piece, and I read about half of it. Let me conclude my remarks with this. In addition to that poem that I shared at the beginning, these three books I'm holding in my hands, they reflect the deep connection that we have with this issue of Zionist Israel and its occupation of Palestine. The Palestinians' Holocaust, American Perspectives. Unfortunately, all three of these books are now out of print. But the Palestinians' Holocaust, American Perspectives, Volume 1. The Message of Rachel Corrie, that young American 23-year-old, gifted, deeply committed, exceptionally spirited American, that on her very first visit to the part of the world that is ironically referred to as the Holy Land, lost her life while trying to prevent the destruction of a Palestinian family's home in the Rafah refugee camp. She was just 23 years of age. And this book, Target Sudan, What's Really Behind the Crisis in Darfur. There's a chapter in this book, and there's an interesting story behind it. There's a chapter in this book, see if I can find the title of it real quick. The author is Mauri Saalakhan.
And the other two books?
I'm the principal author of the other two as well. That's, you know, this part of the education side of our human rights work. Oh my goodness, there's subhanAllah, there's a chapter here, or one of the sub-chapters, having to do with Israel's involvement in that, or the Zionism's involvement in that whole crisis. But the interesting story in this book and how this book came into existence, I was approached by one of the Zionist founders of what was called the Save Darfur Coalition. Anyone here remember that coalition, the Save Darfur Coalition? At the height of the crisis in Darfur, There were a lot of organizations that ended up being persuaded to sign on and become a part of that coalition effort that whose principal objective was, number one, to label what was taking place in Darfur as a genocide, which it wasn't. It wasn't a genocide. The Arab, Sudanese trying to kill off the African Sudanese, when if you had a group of Arabs and Africans in a group together, you would not be able to look at them and determine who is who, because they look the same. The only thing that distinguishes one from the other is the Arabs were able to speak with an Arab tongue. That's it. That's it. And one of the other ironies was that many of the Africans, quote unquote, members of the African tribes that were fleeing the violence in South Sudan, they were fleeing into Khartoum and finding refuge in Khartoum, the capital of the Sudan. But anyway, I was approached. I was approached by one of the principals within the Save Darfur Coalition, because I was this fairly well-known human rights activist in the Washington area, and they felt that if they could win me over, they could, score another significant ally in advancing their agenda. And this was an agenda that was pushed, as I saw it, by Zionists and by ultra right-wing evangelicals. They were the ones that were pushing it. And they did win quite a number of African American leaders over to their side. When they approached me, and I was approached and basically made the offer that if I became a part of the campaign, if I could write a book, because by this time I had written a number of books, if I could write a book about the crisis and write it from that perspective, that this is a genocide taking place, it would guarantee it would be a bestseller, it would do very well, and I could do very well financially. I began to examine, it piqued my interest, just me being approached in that manner. And so I began to do more independent research on the crisis, and I came to a realization that it was not as it was being depicted in the mainstream press and within political circles. And then I ended up taking the exact opposite position than the one that they wanted me to take. We ended up publishing this book, Target Sudan, What's Really Behind the Crisis in Darfur. And that's when my, the distaste or the dislike for Mauri Saalakhan reached a whole nother level within certain circles. But I just want to, I'll end with this. I applaud you, I thank you for organizing this, Marsha, and the others who worked with her to pull this together. It's a very, very important issue. It's a very sensitive issue, and it's also one that carries a certain amount of risk. given all of the undercover promotion that took place around it. I think if we had really thrown it out there, and in terms of promotion, this space would have, we got a nice crowd here now, but the space would have been probably full to the hilt, but we would have also had some of our friends who would not be here to mean us well as well. So I'll stop there and just look forward to the discussion to follow. And again, I've come to know Gilad by reputation. It is my honor to now meet you face to face and to share this space with you. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
I'm a jazz musician, and your presentation is the most jazzy thing I heard in this city for years, But we can talk about jazz as another, what can be more black than jazz, and it's not black anymore. It is plundered like many other things. I think that I'll be shorter. I hope to be shorter, primarily because I have less to say about it than you. Real admiration to the way you presented it. However, some crucial issues that we have to address. We tend to be very careful when it comes to Jews and Israel and Zionism for the obvious reasons. They have a lot of history of being persecuted, and we don't want to be part of it. Despite the fact that there seems to me as if some of them really working hard to bring it on themselves, which is very disturbing to watch. However, I think that as much as we like to be careful, we have to be very precise. And I'm saying it with admiration to Littenthal, but the quote that you presented of Littenthal, Zionism is not Judaism and Judaism is not Zionism, is pretty old. And I think that we can be more precise about the topic. Israel doesn't define itself as a Zionist state, and Israel doesn't define itself as a Judaic state. Israel defines itself as the Jewish state, which means that we have to learn to define or to differentiate between Jews, the people, Judaism, the religion, and Jewishness, the culture, the ideology. I would agree with Lindenthal and with you, I guess, that Jews as people is not a problem. We know enough nice Jews. Judaism is probably not the problem. As we know, some actually very Orthodox Jews support the Palestinians as a collective. Jewishness is a problem. What is Jewishness? Jewishness is different forms of celebration of chosenness. And this is a very problematic concept, because as we know, most Jews, for the time being, are secular. They don't follow Judaism. Many of them don't follow Zionism, but if they identify as Jews, it is because they identify with certain kind of chosenness. And Jewish chosenness is a very open concept. Everything can become chosenness. You can be chosen because you believe in God. You can be chosen because you are an atheist. You don't believe in God. You are very special. You can be chosen because you are communist Bolshevist, because you believe that everyone should share everything. And 3 years later, you can be chosen because you actually believe in free markets. You know, it makes you very special. So it's different sense, different type of exceptionalism that is mostly racially oriented. Jews are not a race. This is quite clear to many of us. Some people dispute it. We tend to believe the Jews are not a race. Just to remind you, Hitler thought that Jews were a race. Now, a lot of Zionists think that they are a race. Jews are not a race. I mean, it is hardly possible that there is a kind of racial bond between Jews from Poland, Ashkenazis, and Ethiopian, or, you know. You look at it and say, they're not the same people. But Jewishness is racist to the core. All right? And these are things that, this is kind of just an introduction. Okay, let's talk about Zionism in Africa, or more precisely, Jews and blacks. Very problematic topic. The other day I learned that the British Zionist pressure group campaign against anti-Semitism, their chairman is actually suing me at the moment, They started a new project. They started a new course, and they teach their fellows how to build bridges with natural allies, so they fight together against anti-Semitism. I thought to myself that it's quite a strange concept, because the last thing that you want to do is to build bridges with potential allies. Bridges are built when there is an obstacle, when there is a river that you cannot cross, you cannot swim, there are crocodiles. You build a bridge. But they're building bridges with potential allies. Very interesting concept. And I think that their misinterpretation of the notion of bridge, because probably none of them was ever involved in building bridges properly, you know, their misconception of bridge will help us to understand the relationship between Jews and black. As we all know, Jews brag a lot about their contribution to the civil rights movement. We learn, according to some sources, that up to 80% of the funds for the NAACP came from Jewish sources. I didn't verify it. I don't know how truthful it is. A lot of Zionists will tell you that Martin Luther King was a Zionist, and there is a quote that they always go back to. I'm not saying that he was, all right, but you probably came across this, all right. So I don't even maybe. I basically said that equating Zionism with Jews is problematic, is anti-Semitic, and so on and so on. I can give you the exact quote. A lot of Jews came with all those anecdotal stories of Mississippi lawyers, civil lawyers. There were 90% of them were Jews, and they were working very hard. I read today, preparing myself to this talk, I read an article by a guy called Howard Sachar, again on a Jewish educational source, very similar to this, the one that you mentioned. And this is, for instance, one of the quotes. At the height of the anti-integration effort in 1957, Rabbi Ira Sanders of Little Rock testified before the Arkansas Senate against pending segregation bills. This is very impressive, despite the fact that we look at what are the jobs of the rabbis. Rabbis are there to keep segregation. They are doing it for 2,500 years. What is kosher diet? Kosher diet is a segregation bill. It means that if a Jew flies from New York to LA, he cannot just go to McDonald's. He has to find a Jewish kosher restaurant. This is segregation bill. You know, do you need me to tell you what happened when a goy fall in love with a Jewish girl? Oy, Veizmir, yeah, it's a disaster. These are all segregation bills. No one keeps segregation better than the Jews. And despite of all of that, they really worked hard. And we know the story about these two Jewish New Yorkers that ended up dying together with this. I'm not from here, so yeah, it said that died with another black guy, and this actually pulled a lot of attention, because, like in the case of the Palestinians, when a Jew dies, you always know the name. This is why the case of Rachel Corrie is so interesting. How many Palestinians died? but we remember Rachel. But everyone knows about Gilad Shalit, and he didn't even die. It's very, very interesting. They're good in PR. But here is where the great story ends. In historical perspectives, the Jewish attitude to black people is a total disaster. It's a minefield. We don't even know where to enter it, and if we enter it, we don't even know if we will ever manage to survive it. Do you remember what happened to Professor Tony Martin, who started to talk about the role of Jews in slavery? In Britain, we have a political activist, Jackie Walker, who is black and a Jew. And she mentioned that ancestors were basically slave traders or whatever. And it was a total disaster. She was expelled from the labor, and even if you are a Jew and say, listen, I'm sorry, it doesn't work.
But she was a Labour MP?
She was an MP, she was an activist in Momentum, in this body that was supporting Jeremy Corbyn. Jackie Walker. And by the way, I have a lot of problem with politics. She's one of those as a black, as a Jew. She never just become an ordinary human, But this is another issue. But she touched this slavery. She made two big crimes. She said the Holocaust should be a general thing, because there are a lot of Holocausts, like slavery, for instance. This was the first time that she was expelled from the labor. What do you mean universal? There is one Holocaust. And the second time was when she referred to the role of Jews in the slave trade. And I'm not so sure that I don't think that we will enter in this time into the role of Jews in the slave trade, but we don't have to. We can see what is happening in Israel at the moment. Israel is the Jewish state, huh? Okay, so in order to understand this complexity, I really deal with culture. Have you heard the word, maybe in New York you have a lot of Jews here, have you ever heard the word Schwarze?
Yes.
Do you know what Schwarze means?
Black.
It's for Schwarz in black, yeah? Schwarze in Jewish culture is a reference to black. From Schwarz, black, it's in German, but Schwarze is in Yiddish. And it is a reference to low being. All right? It's the kind of as low as a goy, Gentile can be. It's not nice. It's a derogatory. Oh, my daughter, she is now going with the Schwarze, oi. Yeah, this is how it works. It's not good. It's not good. But it can get lower. Lower than Schwarze is a Schwarze Chaye. Say Schwarze Chaye.
Schwarze Chaye?
You're not good at it. Schwarze Chaye. It's awful. Schwarze Chaye. Schwarze Chaye. Chaye is a beast. Okay? Schwarze is a beast. So we are talking
A beast.
a beast, an animal. Yeah? So when you see, be careful, the Schwarze Chaye is coming. Yeah? All right. But what is so fascinating about Schwarze Chaye is that when these Jews came to Israel, the Ashkenazi Jews, and they started to have a lot of immigration, I don't know, aliyah, how we should call it, they started to bring all those Arab Jews from Morocco and from Iraq. These became the Schwarze Chaye, the Schwarze Chayes. Okay? Oh my God, it's Schwarze Chaye. All right? And what it really means that these people actually, some of them at least, have a serious problem with blackness. They don't mind the color of black, but when it comes on people, they have an issue. I mean, so if a black car, limousine, no problem. Black dog can be friend, no problem. On people, they don't like it. Now we have a problem. I'm slightly funny, but it's not a funny topic. This is the only way to deal with it. It's not a funny topic. The question is, how do we deal with this conflicting story? On the one hand, we have the Jews at the center of the civil rights movement. On the other hand, culturally, it's a very racist, exceptionalist culture. What I find very troubling is that many of these people who identify as white Jews are those who talk about white supremacy. Now, I'm not supporting of white supremacy, but because before you talk to us about white supremacy, make sure that you uproot all these white supremacy symptoms from your own culture. So you have a guy like Max Blumenthal, who is talking about white supremacy all the time, while at the same time signing on Jews-only letters. You cannot sign on these letters. You are not qualified racially. This is exactly where the problem is. And I decided to look, and I hope that I don't enter a very dangerous territory, because I don't know enough about your internal black conflicts. But I have many friends in Europe and in America in Nation of Islam. And I know some Jews don't like Nation of Islam. How do I know? Because they say, oh, this Gilad, he went to talk with on a TV program with Munir Muhammad. And then I look at Munir Muhammad and say, oh, is this not right? Because he went to a TV program with Gilad Atzmon. So they... you have to decide who is worse, I decided to look at the attitude of, let's say, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish organization, to Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan. And it is frightening. They say, they would say, about the Nation of Islam, in order to grasp blah, 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 America, they see Louis Farrakhan as an American leading anti-Semite. And what they really accuse him of referring to, and this is very important, the Jews as the people behind 9/11, the Jews, the people who dominate American policy, the Jews, the people who are a synagogue of Satan, the Jews are attributed with all those kind of awful things. And then I decided to look into it, because they have a small video of his quotes, and it's not clear at all that he is referring to the Jews. He refers to some Jews. He refers to some Jews. He refers to AIPAC. He refers probably to cultural Marxists. Whether we agree with him or not is a different issue. I think I actually agree with him, so it's not a big issue for me. Yeah, I do think that AIPAC dominate American policy, and I'm not alone. That's right. Yeah. All right? And I do think that some Jews are culturally dominant through Hollywood and so on and so on. And the impact on America of Hollywood, and maybe the entire West, is not necessarily great. And by the way, this is something that's natural for religious people to believe that there is an issue there. But this is not the real issue for me. If Jews are empathic, and for the blacks, and sensitive to the oppression that is happening in this country, and ADL is an organization that cares for human rights, they should be slightly more forgiving when it comes to Mauri Saalakhan. You would expect them to say, you know, all right, he suffers a lot and maybe exaggerate a bit. Can you try to think of something kind of the opposite? Of a German pro-Jew in the 30s starting to get very cross with a Jew who complained about the Nazis? Hey man, don't get, you know, it's say, Nazi is not German. No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. It only happens when we are dealing with Jewish pressure groups. This is exactly the point where we are ready to start to understand what is happening in the relationship between Jews and black, or Israel and Africa. This is exactly building the bridges with potential allies. And Mauri Saalakhan is not a potential ally. He is a truth seeker. We don't like truth seeker. Truth seeker cannot be potential allies. People who dare talking about AIPAC or Hollywood. I wrote, you know, I want to be short, so I'll just read it. Maybe the CIA was correct after all. Jewish solidarity is a Judeo-centric concept. It is basically a search for natural allies rather than a humane, empathic challenge or attempt toward peace and harmony. Jewish New Yorker Philip Wise, who is the editor of Mondowise, a pro-Palestinian group, expressed this sentiment brilliantly in an interview with me. It's quite shocking. This is what he said. I believe all people act out of self-interest. And Jews who define themselves at some level as Jews, like myself, like himself, Philip Wise, for instance, are concerned with Jewish self-interest, which in my case is an end to Zionism. So he is supporting Palestinians not because he cares for Palestinians. He supports Palestinians because he cares for the Jews. So what happened in the Palestinian solidarity discourse? The entire, because they are very dominant, the Jewish bodies, the entire discourse of the oppressed is defined by the sensitivities of the oppressor. And exactly the same thing happened in the black civil rights movement. Or even if we want to talk now about Black Lives Matter. Within 2 months of its formation, they suddenly supported Palestine. Now, I'm not against them supporting Palestine. I support Palestine. But it was, and when you support Palestine, but it was quite peculiar. And it took very short time to understand the Jews were already quite dominant within this movement, which is not necessarily a bad thing if it serves the cause of the people who are oppressed. For why supporting Palestine is good for the Jews. For Rabbi Joachim Prince, you know, who was marching with Martin Luther King, supporting black rights was good for the Jews. It's exactly the same thing. Yet, I didn't say a word about Jews in slavery, and it's a big topic. If you want, you can find a lot of information about it in the net, and it's very interesting. I tell you the truth, I wasn't there in 1650, I don't know, in Senegal. I look old, but not that old. But I do see how the Jewish state treats black refugees. I see the Jewish state lock blacks for being black. What is anti-Semitism? When you discriminate a Jew for being a Jew. The Jewish state is locking black people for being black. It's a mirror image. Nazism, sorry to say it. I grew up in a country that looked down at people warped in dark skin. As I mentioned, Schwarze Chaya. When I left Israel in the 1990s, Ethiopian Jews couldn't donate blood. The blood was dangerous.
That's right. Threw it away.
Yeah. Jews are probably split on their attitude to black, and this is a good thing. I'm not saying the Jews are all racist. Jews are split about it. But Jewish culture and politics have a lot of ground to cover before it can be considered ethical, universal, let alone empathic. That's all.
I want to say that each in the near future, Gilad, you have something tomorrow night. I'd like you to give me details.
Yeah.
And Mauri is driving to Texas to an event that he's organized, and I want you to say something about that.
Shame. It would be great to have you there. Tomorrow I'll be talking about truthfulness in Palestine, and it will be a very, very different talk. I know that quite a few people, I recognize a few people here who are part of the truth movement. And my impetus behind this talk is to suggest to you that in a normal state, truth doesn't need a movement. The fact that we need a movement to tell the truth means that we are in a big trouble. All right? We have to think about it. And maybe we need a movement because we are afraid of the truth. Movements is all something that reminds us of control opposition. And as I mentioned, I am in a kind of legal dispute. I'm sued by this campaign against anti-Semitism, and it's cost a fortune in Britain. So I have two options: either to rob you or to take some hostages, which is something I didn't try yet, or to encourage you to buy my merchandise, my books, and to support me.
Yeah, I'm going to be heading back tonight. I'm going to drop one of my brothers off, and then me and my other brother, we're going to start our drive into the Southwest. I'm a human rights advocate, and we have a lot of cases and issues on our plate that we do our best, to deal with. And one of the cases, the case that has been the most heaviest on my heart for the time that I've been involved in it, is a case that emanates in part from this very city. A Muslim woman by the name of Aafia Siddiqui. Dr. Aafia Siddiqui was put on trial in a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. The judge who presided over her case was openly biased toward her from start to finish. Of course, the prosecution was as well. The prosecution does what prosecutions do in high-profile cases like that. But her case, in the words of former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, and I agree with his description. He has described the case of Aafia Siddiqui as the worst case of individual injustice I have ever witnessed. These were the words that came from the mouth of Ramsey Clark. And You know, Ramsey, we all know he's almost 90 years old, former U.S. Attorney General during one of the most turbulent decades in American history. He has been around, he has seen a lot, experienced a lot, and for him to say that, it carries for me a lot of weight. And certainly for the roughly 3 decades I've been doing human rights work in America, this is the worst case I've ever seen. And it weighs heavily on my heart. So he gets the lion's share of our limited time, energy, and resource. When I leave here tonight, we're going to begin a journey into the Southwest. We're going to be beating the drums once we arrive in Texas, the different centers around the DFW area in preparation for a rally outside of the military base where she's being held under an 86-year sentence.
It's unbelievable.
And it's cover-up. I mean, that's basically what it is. It's cover-up. I mean, Aafia she's a political prisoner who came to this country when she was 18 years old from Pakistan. Comes from a very good family out of Karachi. She's the youngest. She has an older brother and sister. She did her freshman year at the University of Houston. She got a full scholarship to MIT. Went off to MIT. She graduated with honors. Went from there to Brandeis University, graduating again with honors with a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. But because of the attention that she gave to what we call in Arabic da'wah, you know, the teaching and spread of the message of Islam, and because of the role that she played in galvanizing the community of Greater Boston during the Bosnian crisis, she became a person of suspicion after the tragedy of 9/11. And when she went back home in 2002 to Pakistan after 12 fruitful years in the United States, a cloud of suspicion followed her. And on the basis of bad intelligence, the same, and this is if we give the U.S. government the benefit of the doubt, the same type of intelligence that was used to justify a war in Iraq based on weapons of mass destruction that the entire world now knows did not exist. She ended up being targeted for rendition. She was kidnapped with her children, her babies, in March of 2003. And then from 2003 to 2008, she was disappeared. And then she resurfaced after, actually what happened, 4 Arab Muslims escaped from Bagram in Afghanistan. She was kidnapped from Karachi, Pakistan, her home city. 4 Arab Muslims escaped from Bagram in Afghanistan, and when they escaped, they told stories about how they had been captured or kidnapped, secretly held, tortured, and they all told the stories of this one woman whose name they didn't know, but as they were describing her, people in the know began to put 2 and 2 together. And as word began to spread and pressure began to build on the American authorities, they ended up releasing Aafia and then setting her up to be killed. She was shot by an American soldier who panicked. She didn't die. She was the Afghan police and soldiers insisted she get medical attention. She was helivaced to another area where she received emergency treatment, and then she was brought back to the U.S. in violation of international law, Afghan sovereignty, rehabilitated well enough over an 18-month period to be put on trial in Lower Manhattan, and then the rest, as they say, is history. A non-sequestered jury that came and went from the courthouse every day, seeing the blistering headlines about Al-Qaeda mom and this, just these lurid descriptions of this woman. Found her guilty despite the evidence in her favor. They hadn't come up with a story as to why she was shot. They claimed that one of the American soldiers as she was waiting to be interrogated, he laid his M4 rifle on the floor. She grabbed it off the floor like a female Rambo, took the safety off of it, and tried to shoot her way out of captivity. In a crowded room, no one was shot but her. And she was charged with attempted murder. Attempted murder, when no one was injured but her. And she got an 86-year sentence. And right now she's on a military base, of a shell of her former self in Fort Worth, Texas.
And Zionism played a very pronounced role in the atmosphere that was generated around this woman, leading up to the trial, during the trial, and then after she was convicted. It's sad, but anyway, so we're going to be headed there. What I did, the only thing I brought with me, and given that my friend here has come the distance that he has come to be a part of this forum, you know, he gets priority.
Oh, no.
He gets priority. But if you have something left over after you purchase his books, and whatever you see, he's a jazz musician. I guess it's a jazz CD that you brought with you?
Yeah.
Okay. After you've purchased what you can from him to support his campaign, his efforts, then if you have something left over, the CDs, and that will, and the CD is our good friend George Galloway.
Yeah, he's
Speaking on the crisis in Palestine. I had the pleasure of introducing him to an audience of about 600 people in the Washington area a few years ago.
Yeah.
And he gave one of the best speeches on Palestine that I've ever heard anyone give. And so that's what that CD is, his speech, my introduction, his speech. We encourage people to make copies of it, share it with others, take the CD and spread the word. So, and I want to say one other thing before we close, because I knew you was going to be touching on the issue of what's going on right now with the Africans that are in Israel. I just want to say a little bit more about it. One of the things that really surprised me, it shouldn't have, but it surprised me, was the level of racial animosity that does exist among the Zionists, often in the name of Jewishness and tribalism. I mean,
tribalism, it's isolationism.
Tribal against the falashas. I remember years ago, I followed it very closely when leaders in Zionist Israel, apartheid Zionist Israel, were, just exerting all the pressure they possibly could on the powers that be to get the falashas to allow them to be able to leave and immigrate into Israel. And all it was about, I understood it then, was about just boosting the number of quote-unquote Jews in that occupied land. That's what it was all about. But it was almost from the time that they set foot on, this sacred political soil, that they were treated very differently. And so differently, in fact, that I remember becoming pleasantly aware of and rather surprised, amused, that there was a Black Panther movement that was started within Israel, comprised of these African Jews, a Black Panther movement.
It was North Africans. Yeah, and they were basically Arab Jews.
And it tickled me pink. Really, it really did. But then you bring it all the way up to where we are now, and when you juxtapose what is happening right now with the Black African refugees that are in Israel, and the way that they are being treated, the way that they are being manipulated, and I've seen some video of how they are being attacked verbally and physically. Just the verbal attacks that they have to put up with, from these mobs sometimes.
Yesterday there was an incredible video, painful to watch. It's in Hebrew, in a bus, I think, or in a train. I couldn't figure out. It went viral on Twitter. Basically, an African woman sitting in a bus, and a woman sitting near to her, or in proximity. We couldn't see who was the woman who was talking, and she's talking about her in the phone to a friend. How smelly and how disgusting! It's unbelievable
Wow.
And this is something. And there are people in the bus, and nobody tries to stop her. I think that Black Americans don't remember. It's not something that we remember in our lifetime. Probably your parents or You know, it's something that it is unheard of. Now, what is very interesting is that Israel and Zionism were born to counter this aspect of Jewish culture. Zionism was a promise to civilize the Jews by means of homecoming. It promised to make the Jews into productive people. So rather than being bankers and bourgeoisies, you know, they became farmers and so on and so on. And it really works for 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, they realized that the Palestinians were slightly cheaper. And this was pretty much the end of the Zionist dream. But there were supposed to be people who live together with their neighbors. Even this conflict with the Palestinians, people saw it coming. Funny enough, Jabotinsky, who is a right-wing icon, believed that if Jews maintain majority, they would be able to live with the Palestinian in sharing the land. He spoke about every street being written, in Hebrew and in Arabic, having dual language and so on and so on. And nothing is left out of it. All of that evaporated. And I'm really working on this topic at the moment. And it is very interesting that you mentioned the Black Panthers, because after 67, after the big victory of 67, the Israelis, the new Israelis, my parents' generation probably, I was too young, believed that the Zionist project was a big success. Here we are, we defend ourselves, we win such a great victory, we squash 3-4 Arab armies all on our own, we do it without a superpower and so on and so on. And at that moment, they give up on the idea of the Israeli, and there are many new forces that are coming up, the Arab Jews, the Russian Jews, Romanian Jews, people who didn't manage to integrate into the Zionist dream. It's not that they didn't want, they just couldn't get in, because it was too crowded by Polish and Russian Jews, second generation and so on and so on. And then they say, we are the Jewish state. We are not the Zionist state. We are not the Israeli state. We are the Jewish state. And by saying we are the Jewish state, all those bad symptoms of racism, exceptionalism, chosenness coming back. And we see the debate in Israel. Netanyahu was zigzagging like 2-3 weeks ago, because there are forces in Israel that see that what they're doing with migrants, with all those refugees, is impossible. And now another very interesting story. I spent the last 2 weeks in Turkey and Greece. And when I was there, I had to give few talks about similar issues to do with Palestine. And I was watching the news. Now, there is a lot of immigration from Pakistan, from Syria, that is going through Turkey and Greece. The Israelis are really concerned by the global warming. They are fearful of the possibility that the whole of Africa will try to get to Europe through Israel. I'm not joking. All right? And they say, listen, they try the sea, it doesn't work. We are then the next option. Now, when I'm reading all these ludicrous fears, I'm in Turkey. While Israel is building now humongous walls, now, which is something very interesting, because the whole idea of Israel was to get the Jew out of the ghetto wall. Now they've managed to build the biggest ghetto walls in the history of the Jews. I'm in Turkey, and they also know about global warming, and the next day I'm in Greece, and they get a lot of, and they don't even consider the possibility of surrounding themselves with walls. All right? So we are dealing with culture that is really, really remote and really foreign to our understanding. It's unusual. It's really, really unusual. And we have to accept it. We have to accept it when we deal with Israel, with Zionism, that I think is an irrelevant concept, where we deal with AIPAC domination of this country. Just final word. I believe that the fear that these people express of anti-Semitism, bigotry, racism is basically projection.
Yeah, I agree.
When you are racially driven, you reject other, you feel contempt towards otherness and other people, you're doomed to believe that other people are like yourself, and it is very frightening. This is anti-Semitism. This is what anti-Semitism is all about. They are tormented by their own hatred. That's it.
Let me just say that both of these incredible teachers are available to speak. And if anybody can put together an audience, please contact them through their email.
And by the way, thank you so much for Marsha. It's a great room, and it's a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
How many people are aware of the fact that our police forces across the entire country, including New York, have been sending our American police to Israel for assassination training? How many people know that? Okay. This is a very, very important issue. Not to mention the fact that the military, our military has also, to add to the issue, been giving massive amounts of military equipment to local police forces, tanks, everything you can imagine, to your local police force. Even small towns are accepting this equipment. It is outrageous. At any rate, I came across this article last week. It says, Durham, North Carolina, first to ban police exchanges with Israel. Oh. Every town in this country, every city, every state must lobby their electeds to do exactly the same thing, to demand that our tax dollars not be spent to send our police, who are supposed to be protecting us, over to Israel to learn how to cut us down, shoot us in the back, and get rid of us. That is something that must be discussed with the elected officials. Even though they're totally controlled from the top. You might think that a black legislator or elected official represents your black community. They do not. They do not. The person in New York City who controls all the electeds is Chuck Schumer. And if you don't think so, go to some political events and watch and see what happens. It's disgusting. These people, I went to the inauguration of Corey Johnson, our council speaker. It looked like a Jewish celebration. It was unreal. Unreal. What happens is the Jewish community, especially the right-wing Jewish community, finds young people who have potential. They might be good looking, have skills, organizing skills, whatever. They approach them, they start giving them money, and all of a sudden, when somebody gives you money, they own you. They own you.
By the way, you don't need me to tell you, and this is what I'm doing in my recent book, Being in Time, that America is divided. And it is basically divided between those who see themselves as Americans and those who define themselves as a black, as a Jew, as a woman, as a lesbian, and these are the identitarians. Funny enough, some right-wings now define themselves as identitarians. What is very interesting is that the institutions that fund all those identitarian groups within the so-called left are primarily led by Jewish financiers. And I'm talking about George Soros. So this is the story. This is a very, very simple story. And when you look at the other side, which is Donald Trump, it doesn't look much better. You know, you have Kushner and this Michael Cohen. And I don't know if you saw, this is something amazing. 2 days ago in The Guardian, they revealed that Trump hired an ex-Mossad agent. You didn't hear anything about it in America. It's unbelievable. It's not kind of I'm talking about Guardian news. It was in every Israeli paper. According to The Guardian, Trump hired an Israeli company to dig some crap on people within Obama administration.
It came out today.
It was in May.
Yes.
It was in May. Now I just landed kind of a few hours ago, but as far as I tried to look on Fox News, CNN, there was nothing. When I look, how do you know about it?
It came out today.
It came out today in the news.
Yes.
It came out today?
Yeah.
Because this is a massive story. And what I did find today is the New Yorker, that this is actually the same company that was working for Harvey Weinstein when he hired them to mount pressure on women that were subject to his abuse. Now this is America. What is left of this country? You know, you are basically an occupied zone. This is why I don't think that we have to talk about Zionism. This is the biggest colony of Zion. You know, and I would say, and I'm saying it all the time, actually, I believe that I'm the one who coined we are all Palestinians. And I believe that we are all Palestinians, by the way, even including the Israelis, because like the Palestinians, we cannot even utter the name of our oppressor. All right? This is a very, very serious situation, especially in this country, because we are more or less, all of us, the same age. We grew up to believe that this was the land of the free. It's the land of the freaks. It's very, very dangerous. And now, if we are Palestinians, you have to now you understand why they have to train in assassination in Israel.
Yeah. And one
It's very
word.
simple.
Who knows who the Stasi were?
You know.
Who were the Stasi?
East German police.
Right. The Stasi were the East German police, and they were the most feared and the most vicious of all the Eastern Bloc spy organizations for the government. We hired a Mr. Wolf to set up Homeland Security here. He was head of the Stasi. The head of the Stasi was hired to set up our homeland security. You got it? You understand the implications of that? It's got nothing to do with helping us. That's why they don't help Puerto Rico or any other place. Because it's all about spying and controlling us. That's what it's all about, homeland security. Okay, you got a question?
Yeah, but he's leaving.
Nature calls.
Yeah, two things. Glad you mentioned that there was Black Panthers in Israel. And myself, I was in the Black Panther Party in the early 70s. We actually met some of the originators of that Black Panther Party in Israel. But interesting, what happened was it put so much fear into Israel at that time that Golda Meir gave them basically those their basic reformist requests, but granted all those things to that party then. So that basically killed that movement itself. But they never actually met with us, but they heard about it. And if people go to the Schomburg, there's a Black Power exhibit there. You can actually see photos of the Black Panther Party in Israel, Australia, New Zealand, England, all over the world. Because that movement was an international movement outside of our embassy we had in Algeria. My question is, actually two questions. The situation with the politicians here, that most of them have dual citizenship here and in Israel. So it shouldn't surprise us that much that the votes are always in favor of what goes on in Israel. Because I haven't seen an updated list in a long time. Maybe somebody can put that together. But that whole dual citizenship issue is something that's pertinent. And my second question is, you mentioned situation with Dr. Tony Martin, and even you mentioned Louis Farrakhan now. But just looking back at the time, we look at Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, where he was attacked viciously by the Zionists, in terms of him supporting the whole thing about Zionism being racist, and looking at the whole Israeli attacks on South Africa, in favor of apartheid. So my question is, nobody mentioned Stokely tonight, so do you have any reflections on that, on Kwame Ture?
Yeah, I mean, you want to go first?
No.
All right. I have nothing but love and respect for the memory of our departed warrior, Kwame Ture, and many of the others that were part of that movement of determined, in your face consciousness. Former A-Trap Brown, now Imam Jamil, Abdullah Alameen, and there's so many others. I mean, I did a Facebook presentation just about maybe 3 months ago on Fred Hampton, because he was such an incredible young figure. And, so, yeah, I just got nothing but love. And I think, in fact, I know that part of the challenge that we have here in this country, given the fact that so many politicians have dual citizenship, and those that don't have dual citizenship have dual loyalty, which brings us to, in the very forward of this book, this little book on the message of Rachel Corrie. When I met her family right after she was killed, when I met her family, I promised them, and this was like just a few days after she was killed. We met in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington. It was a vigil. It was held, very well-attended vigil. And I said to them, first of all, I thanked them, for having a daughter like that. I mean, it said a lot about them to me, about her parents. And I thanked them, and I expressed my condolences, and I also conveyed a promise. I said, we are going to do as much as we can to make sure that what she came to symbolize is not forgotten. Around the same time that Rachel was killed, there was also a young British
Yeah.
male that was shot in the head, Thomas Herndl.
Yeah.
Shot in the head.
Sniper.
Huh?
By sniper, yeah.
Yeah, by a sniper. And we just wanted to I mean, this book became a manifestation of that promise that I made to her family. And we put this book out maybe 2 or 3 months after she was killed. It opens with the farewell address of the first president of the United States, George Washington. And it reads as follows. In his farewell address to the Union, the first president of the United States, General George Washington, conveyed a message that a host of succeeding presidents and policymakers have assiduously chosen to ignore. And I've had an opportunity in different forums that have been held at some of the think tanks to raise this issue with a sitting politician or one that was formerly in office. And every time I've raised this issue, every time, you could almost smell the embarrassment oozing from them and their feeble attempts to try to respond in a way that would look good for this apartheid state. He said, quote, "A passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils, because it leads to concessions to the favorite nation or privileges denied to others, which is apt doubly to injure the nation making the concession, both by unnecessarily parting with what ought to have been retained and by exciting jealousy, ill will, and a disposition to retaliate in the parties from whom equal privileges are withheld. It gives to ambitious," and this is really key here, this is George Washington, his farewell address. "It gives to ambitious, corrupted, or deluded citizens who devote themselves to the favorite nation the facility to betray or sacrifice the interests of their own country without odium, sometimes even with popularity. Real patriots who may resist the intrigues of the favorite are liable to become suspected and odious, while its tools and dupes usurp the applause and confidence of the people to surrender their interests," end quote. This was the warning that Washington gave to his compatriots then and those who would succeed him. And from my humble perspective, as someone who travels the country doing the work that I've been doing for so many years, there is a certain level of awareness about the evils that Israel has been committing with support from the United States, but there is a tolerance of it because of the way the narrative has been so cleverly and relentlessly manipulated. And there's a good friend of mine, and I know most of you here in this space would know of her either directly or by reputation. She has an organization called If Americans Knew.
Yeah.
Allison Weir.
Yeah.
I mean, she is really on point. And the work that Allison has been doing has been, in my humble opinion, some of the most valuable work in terms of really awakening people to what is being done in their name. And this is what we need more of. I mean, when I was with South African Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu at the Old South Church in Boston a few years ago, his quote is in here, where he compared what is happening to Palestinians with what happened to blacks under South African apartheid. I've heard from other black South Africans who have said it is even worse. What's going on with the Palestinians is worse because those maniacs in South Africa were not able to take it to the nth degree. But Israel has been able to do that up until now, and it's crazy. It's crazy. But this is, for me, this is the real challenge. We have got to stop allowing the politicians from both parties to get away with being the willing slaves of this of this state, this illegitimate state that represents some of the worst of what we are seeing in today in terms of man's inhumanity to man.
I totally agree, and especially about, the reference to Alison Weir, whom I admire, like yourself. But I think that it is actually slightly worse. It's not that we Americans or Brits tolerate Israel crimes. It is far worse, actually. We are willing to commit crimes on behalf of Israel. And if you look at the recent attack on Syria that was perpetrated by America, Britain, and France. These are three countries that are dominated by Jewish lobbies. I don't want to say Israel lobbies or Zionist lobbies. They are Jewish lobbies. It's AIPAC here. It's the Conservative Friends of Israel in Britain. It's the CRIF in France. How do they get away with it? How is it that the media that is supposed to protect us, to ask questions?
They are the media.
They are the media.
This is 100% true answer, but there is another layer here. And in order to understand the other layer, we have to understand what Jewish power is. Jewish power is the power to suppress criticism of Jewish power. All right?
Yeah.
This is very, very important. Dershowitz, Wolfowitz, Atzmonwitz, we are not Jewish power. Jewish power, it is that mechanism that dismantles our ability to say what we think, and actually this is something that is sustained largely by the left. And this is very, very devastating, and this is why I believe that we are now well within the post-political phase. There is no really difference between left and right. It's not the issue of dual citizenship. This is just a matrix of power. It's the idea that our president, your president, sorry, not mine, your president is engaged in some acts, like the recent story. I'm looking at it from reading The Guardian, it looks like treason. It doesn't even make it into the American news. What is it? How do we deal with it? And I'm pretty sure what we see in Britain, which is very interesting, you probably don't follow it, but I'll just tell you about it briefly. The Labour Party, we have two parties, Conservatives and Labour. The Labour Party that is supposedly more like the Democratic Party, although they are pretty different, is led by a guy that his entire career was a fringe character, Jeremy Corbyn, an old commie. He's not a communist, but an old Marxist, really. And they couldn't believe how popular he is. In the last 2 years, this man has been subject to slander, abuse. He has been called an anti-Semite. They protest against him in the street, and he only become stronger by the day. All right, I believe that people out there see what is going on. I believe that people in this country also see what is going on. I'm not a Trump supporter, but Trump was elected as a sign of fatigue, of general fatigue. Said, we don't care who it is, but we don't want a politician. Why we don't want a politician? Trump was elected because his entire election, according to the Jews, was dog whistling, anti-Semitic slogans. I've been in a conference with some right-wing American thinkers, and this question came up, what is the story with Trump? We believed in something and look where we are now. And one of them, who is very clever, said, listen, this Trump is not a big success, but the next Trump will know what he's doing, all right? Because what is very clear now, that there is enough in the West, it's not just in America, there is enough fatigue there to bring a change, and it's a very dangerous point because it can turn into hardcore fascism, and it can be a new beginning. And this is why we have to be alert, on alert. Yeah. It's very interesting.
Are there any other questions? Well, I want to thank both our teachers and speakers.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Asher, it is so.